Jonathan Edwards is the last of the great Puritan clerics. Remember that we've covered a rather large time span here, beginning in the early 1600s, and by the time we get to Jonathan Edwards, we're in the mid-1700s. So we've covered over 100 years in just a short space of time here in the course. But this is a fairly substantial, long period of time. And so we've gone through several generations since those early founding Puritans. Puritanism is dying out by the time we get to Jonathan Edwards. It has, in many respects, already died out by the time we get to him. He's trying to revive something that's on the edge of disappearing. And so his famous sermon, a very, very famous sermon, in fact, the most famous sermon in American literature, Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God, it is a classic of the hellfire and brimstone type. But he's delivering this to his own congregation in hopes of reviving them, to bring them back to the initial fervor that he saw as he looks back at his ancestors and back at the traditions of Puritanism. So this is something that he sees very much in danger, this whole tradition, and he's trying to save it before it finally fades away entirely. Jonathan Edwards is at the center of what we call the Great Awakening, a religious revival movement of the mid-1700s. This is one of those revival movements that begins to sweep through substantial parts of the country. It's not located in just any one town or with any one congregation or even with any one particular denomination, but it's one of those more general sorts of revivals, much as we might make a comparison with the revivals of Billy Graham in our more modern times, as he began to transcend the religious differences of denominations and reawaken people to their religious faith and heritage. So Jonathan Edwards is at the heart of that. And this religious reawakening then sweeps through the eastern coast, what we think of as the East Coast today, which would have been the primary colonies at the time, of course. As this movement catches on, it in some cases goes beyond what its originators perhaps intended. And there were some abuses that found their way into it. Remember that they are preaching largely what is called still Calvinism. And in Calvinism we have the idea of predestination. And in this whole idea, people had already been determined as being part of the elect or not part of the elect before they were ever born. God has done this from the creation, from the beginning of everything. And God has set out who will be part of the elect, who will not be part of the elect, and no one can change that. It's not based on an individual's decision. I can't decide to be part of the elect, according to Calvinism. God has made that decision for me before I ever drew my first breath. And so when they would preach Calvinism from the pulpit, if I did not feel like I was part of the elect, that God had not called me, then there was no hope for me. It didn't matter how much I prayed, how much I read my Bible, how good I might be. The decision as to whether I'd be part of the elect or not was God's decision. It was not my decision. And so there were some people who became desperate in this, and they felt like they were not part of the elect, and they felt then they had nothing that they could possibly do to save themselves. And you have a few isolated cases of people actually going out and committing suicide after listening to some of these sermons because they felt there was nothing to live for anymore. Well, this is some of the excess that at a later time came into this Great Awakening. It had some excesses like this and abuses that resulted in a bit of criticism for the movement. This was not all that widespread, but incidences like these gained a fairly large reputation. So the Great Awakening overall was a good thing. It was a great religious reawakening for the people, but it did have its abuses, particularly in its latter days of the movement. And you'll read about some of these if you happen to read about some of the period. Enjoy the sermon. Sinners in the Hands of an Angry God is a good view at the way the strict Calvinist would view God. He is an angry God. He's not the God of love that we hear about today. This is the God of vengeance and judgment, and the God who is tempted to destroy things because of the sin he sees before him. So as you read this, keep that in mind. This is the Calvinist impression of God, and it differs quite a bit from what we typically hear in many sermons today.